fellow Franciscans, you must leave this place at once. The devil is roaming in this abbey. On behalf of the Benedictine Order, I am honored to welcome you and your Franciscan brothers to our abbey. The other delegates, they have arrived. Ubertino de Casal has been here for some weeks. The others are due tomorrow. You must be very tired after your very long journey. No, not particularly. I trust you are not in need of anything. No, thank you. Well, then, I bid you peace. I'm sorry to see one of your brethren has recently gathered unto God. Yes, terrible loss. Brother Adelmo was one of our finest illuminators. Not Adelmo of Antranto. You knew him? No, but I knew and admired his work. His humor and comic images were almost infamous. But he was said to be a young man. Yes, very young indeed. An accident, no doubt. Yes, as you say, an accident. Well, that is Brother William, I speak to you candidly. You seem most anxious to do so. When I heard you were coming to our abbey, I thought it was an answer to my prayers. Here, I said, as a man who has knowledge both of the human spirit and the wiles of the evil one. This is my novice, Anzo, the youngest son of the Baron of Milk. Please, do continue. The fact is, Brother Adelmo's death has caused much spiritual unease upon my flock. Yes, we found the body after a hailstorm, horribly mutilated, dashed against a rock at the foot of the tower, under a window, which was, how should I say this, which was found closed, which was, somebody told you, had it been found open, you would not have spoken of spiritual unease. You would have concluded that he'd fallen. Brother William, the window cannot be opened, nor is the glass shattered, nor is any access to the roof above. Oh, I see. And because you can offer no natural explanation, your monks suspect the presence of supernatural force within these walls. That's why I need the counsel of an acute man such as you, Brother William. Acute in uncovering, and imprudent, if necessary, in covering up the book before the people, delegates arrive. Surely you know, my lord, I no longer deal in such matters. And I am indeed reluctant to burden you with my dilemma. But unless I can put the minds of the flock at rest, I have no alternative but to summon the help of the Inquisition.
Hello, my name is Major Mike Webb, and a tale written by Umberto Eco in 1980 is a great tale about superstition, science, and coincidence that often distorts human perceptions about what they believe in is science because of natural fear and the unknown.
Vade retro satana, vade retro satana, vade retro satana, vade retro satana, adjure te spiritus nequissime, per Deum omnipotentum. The power of Christ compels you.
By April 8, 2020, Catherine Schaefer at the Pew Research Center, which had performed extensive survey-based research throughout the pandemic on various topics, was already convinced, based upon the March 17, 2020 report by Christian Anderson of Scripps Research Laboratories,
and who had himself questioned the origins of the novel coronavirus in an infamous email to Dr. Fauci on January 31st, 2020, that scientists have determined the virus came about naturally, importing for that research institute an implicit bias, but yet had observed that there is some uncertainty about how it first infected people. Nonetheless, at that time, Pew Research Center had acknowledged that while a plurality of Americans, 43%, said the new coronavirus most likely came about naturally, agreeing with Dr. Anderson's report, nearly 3 in 10, 29%, said it most likely was created in a lab, according to a Pew Research Center survey conducted from March 10th to the 16th, 2020, all of which would have predated by at least one day the publishing online of Dr. Anderson's report. By April 2020, around a quarter of adults, 23%, said it is most likely that the current strain of coronavirus was developed intentionally in a lab. Another 6% said it was most likely made accidentally in a lab. A quarter said they aren't sure where the virus originated. So, from a strictly empirical basis, one reasonable question would be upon what authoritative sources those persons who had expressed their opinions about the origins of the coronavirus had relied. And more likely than not, despite what would become the beginning of discussions regarding evolving science that by July 2020 would find as many as 73% of Democrats and 66% of Republicans very confident that they understood the science of a novel coronavirus, even Pew Research Center had acknowledged that by the summer of 2020, most Americans had been receiving their information not from science reports about what was essentially a scientific phenomenon with incredible evolutionary pressure of a lethal and allegedly highly contagious disease, but rather from social media and news, getting to the point where, as had been observed by the Washington Post by June 2020, that months of discord about the coronavirus epidemic have transformed even the cloth mask into a potent political symbol, touted by Democrats as a key part of communal responsibility, labeled by some GOP leaders as a sign of government overreach, and as a scarlet letter penned on the week, none of which has anything to do with science at all, but all about politics. Hello, my name is Major Mike Webb, and on September 28, 2022, although not reported in the press, a matter presented to the courts on what attorneys would describe as a petition for writ of mandamus, and seeking to compel the Commonwealth attorney or prosecutor to convene a grand jury investigation into the death of Bishop Gerald Glenn, the former senior pastor for the New Deliverance Evangelistic Church in Chesterfield, who had contracted COVID-19, was unprecedentedly certified to the Chief Justice for the Virginia State Supreme Court to appoint an impartial judge to preside over the case. That is a significant moment in courts to have even occurred outside the context of the broader pandemic. But even more significant, that it had occurred in only just 2 weeks, and still yet had failed to make even one headline in any newspaper in which the primary focus was the critical midterm elections. And being such a high-profile case on such a politically divisive issue, it could not be reasonably claimed that it was not critical election information. And yet, nor was it reported by any news content provider on November 4th, 2022, the day before the election, that the state Supreme Court had finally appointed a retired judge to hear that case.
Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana, adjure te spiritus nequissime, per Deum omnipotentum. The power of Christ compels you.
Since yet another similar case is now being filed at the Circuit Court for the City of Alexandria, Virginia, and since this is the very first pandemic incident homicide case in history, it is probably important first to understand the science to be able to follow the science, and how this matter had advanced so far in rather quick time. And like for most things in science, this critical inquiry actually should begin not in medias res or in the middle of things, but at the very beginning, going back to that point in time in America when, whether by intuition, lucky guess, or just skepticism or cynicism, around a quarter of adults, 23%, said it is most likely that the current strain of coronavirus was developed intentionally in a lab. Another 6% said it was most likely made accidentally in a lab. A quarter said they aren't sure where the virus originated. And so, let's begin with whether or not there is an empirical basis upon which to serve as a reasonable foundation for rejecting the notion that a novel coronavirus had a natural origin. And in fact, there is considerable scientific basis for the theory or hypothesis that a zoonotic evolution did not occur, but rather a novel coronavirus had found origins in a laboratory, a theory that has been rejected by the illustrious Dr. Anthony Fauci, the president, and even apparently the director of national intelligence and the intelligence community. But it was the basis for the beginning of our litigation in Alexandria at the beginning of the pandemic. And let's just take a little time to try to understand that science that actually caused both the city of Alexandria and mayor, as well as the governor of Virginia, to try to evade coming to court.
Vade retro satana, vade retro satana, vade retro satana, vade retro satana, adjure te spiritus nequissime, per Deum omnipotentum. The power of Christ compels you.
In the summer of 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court decided what had been popularly described as the DACA case, DHS v. Board of Regents for the University of California. And that case had reiterated that it is a foundational principle of administrative law that judicial review of agency action is limited to the grounds that the agency invoked when it took the action, classified at the time, so to speak. And when a novel coronavirus first emerged in China in December 2019, even if everything about a novel coronavirus may not have yet been known, replication and replicability of results is the very foundation of science. And there was a lot of scientific information about coronaviruses generally, as well as about viruses generally. And one of the most important was the fact that even though viruses and their virials are the most abundant biological particles in the world, before a novel coronavirus, there were only a total of 219 that had been found harmful to mankind, which would make a brand new threat from a virus at least suspicious to a scientist. Even though there are over 3,000 coronaviruses that infect birds, and over 3,000 coronaviruses that infect mammals, the novel coronavirus was only the 7th coronavirus to present a threat to mankind. And more intriguingly, of the total of 7, as many as 5 had suddenly been discovered between 2003 and 2005, including SARS, which raises a reasonable inference of suspicion, or should, at least to a scientist. And on January 24, 2020, when CNN had headlined a story that the coronavirus may have found an origin in a Chinese crate or king cobra, there should have been an alarm bell. many alarm bells ringing throughout the scientific community because coronaviruses do not infect snakes or reptiles. But by March 2020, Wei Ji and other scientists had determined that the novel coronavirus had what was described as an ophidian codon usage bias, or affinity for infection of snakes, and that simply had never occurred in nature before. But that, like the recent case involving Bishop Glenn in Chesterfield, for whatever reason, never made headline news. And that is suspicious.
Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Adjure te spiritus nequissime. Per Deum omnipotentum. The power of Christ compels you.
In courts, attorneys are familiar with what is called a burden of proof, ranging from a preponderance of evidence, or more than a scintilla, to the one with which most crime show and courtroom drama fans are probably more familiar, beyond a reasonable doubt. And just based upon what had been known about viruses generally, and specifically coronaviruses at the time, one could not reasonably assert that beyond a reasonable doubt, a novel coronavirus had been the result of a zoonotic evolution, because the vast body of science before it, standing on the shoulders of giants, should have dictated that it should never have come into existence at all. However, because the president, with the support of agencies like NIAID and CDC, have claimed that the novel coronavirus had been zoonotically evolved, a proposition about which at least Pew seemed to agree in April 2020. The case is not quite that simple in a courtroom because of what is described as regulatory deference doctrine, as articulated in the 1984 case of Chevron USA v. Natural Resource Defense Council, or NRDC, which reiterated that courts have long recognized that considerable weight should be accorded to an executive department's construction of a statutory scheme it is entrusted to administer. And if this choice represents a reasonable accommodation of conflicting policies that were committed to the agency's care by the statute, we should not disturb it unless it appears from the statute or its legislative history that the accommodation is not one that the Congress would have sanctioned, because they are the experts, which makes it a very difficult challenge for a plaintiff, because even if the question is fairly debatable, if it is a tie when you challenge a governmental rule or determination, you can't fight City Hall. Basically, thus under regulatory deference doctrine, you lose, which is very much like mounting a facial challenge to a statute, where as stated in U.S. v. Salerno, the challenger must establish that no set of circumstances exist under which the act would be valid. Essentially, the government would have to be categorically incorrect, clearly erroneous, and a finding of fact is clearly erroneous if it is without factual support in the record, or if the appellate court, after reviewing all the evidence, is left with a definite and firm conviction that a mistake has been made. So, for now, on establishing beyond a reasonable doubt that the government was wrong regarding the origins of a novel coronavirus, let's just stand by on that and examine another early known aspect of the disease that would, by March 11, 2020, be declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization because it had spread around the world.
Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Adjure te spiritus nequissime. Per Deum omnipotentum. The power of Christ compels you.
The virus had spread around the world.
And when describing infectious or communicable diseases being transmitted from person to person, Bruce Aylward, the assistant WHO director, had provided by March 2020 a formulaic expression to assist the average layman who may possess no medical knowledge on exactly how this transmission should occur. Getting the virus is a function of whether someone's got it, how long they're exposed, and how much virus they are shedding. So, to simplify, we have an infected person, or what is often described in case studies as an index case, or if you prefer, a patient zero. And this index case would be required to do at least two things: come in contact with someone who is not infected, and then shed a sufficient amount of the virus in what is described as a viral load, or more specifically, a viable viral load, because an inert or non-viable virus particle would not be able to transmit the disease, and that would cause infections, probably on some exponential level, as that person infects other persons and that person infects other persons, and so on and so on. But all on a delayed time fuse, because the virus has an incubation period. It would not be immediate, like with tear gas, where you're going to feel the effects within 5 to 20 seconds. But rather will be extended out to 4, maybe 5 days. And this issue regarding transmission of the virus had been the key element in the case involving Bishop Glenn's death in Chesterfield. That has become the cornerstone of the newest case in Alexandria, because after a robust review conducted by 1,800 teams of at least 5 epidemiologists who had reviewed a total of 55,924 laboratory-confirmed cases in China by February 20 of 2020, or about 19 times more cases than had yet been reported in the entire United States by mid-March 2020, they had found a secondary attack rate among trace contacts, which generally have been blown off for whatever reason, that range between 0.9 and 4.8%, prompting the conclusion that it is not clear whether this correlates with the presence of an infectious virus. Let's explain that further. A less than 5% secondary attack rate is 4 times too low to validate the presence of a disease being transmitted from person to person, and 12 times too low to be described as a highly contagious disease that only then would be capable of setting off a super spreader event. And a scientist, especially a microbiologist or virologist or even epidemiologist, should know this. And if not, they could simply refer back to the conclusion of the WHO report, the organization that had declared the pandemic as the experts. And if Dr. Fauci had claimed otherwise, as he in fact did after the Rose Garden infections, that would be clearly erroneous, requiring some explanation, regardless of the origin of the virus. But if a person could not transmit the virus to another person, how could there have been 55,924 laboratory-confirmed cases who have been examined in China? How could there be over 97 million cases today in the United States? If the virus could not be transmitted from person to person, that virus could neither zoonotically evolve into a pandemic nor escape from a laboratory to cause a pandemic, and would have to have some other means of being transmitted to so many people all around the world, and about which that original report in China had provided at least some clues, stating that the virus had been found to exhibit a pattern of distinct clustered outbreaks with no wider community spread, which would be impossible for a virus where there was exponential transmission potential, but a delayed fuse incubatory period before a person even realized they had the disease or even started to become infectious to infect others. But which also would suggest that the virus transmission was not associated with a particular person serving as an index case to introduce the virus to other persons, but rather had something to do with the location at which the persons had been infected, because that is the only time when you're going to have discrete, identifiable clusters where you could determine that the virus outbreak began. And the only way for a virus with those characteristics to be able to travel all the way to Chesterfield, Virginia, so as to infect a person like Bishop Glenn, or the 30 other bishops that happened to die before the first Easter pandemic, or even the Graveson family in Alexandria, or Pastor Don Davidson at the First Baptist Church of Alexandria, would be for that virus to be deployed as a biological agent of terror, whether it found its origins in a zoonotic source or a laboratory.
Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Adjure te spiritus nequissime. Per Deum omnipotentum. The power of Christ compels you.
Motive means an opportunity, the classic elements of proof in a criminal case. And certainly there was more than ample opportunity and means during what has been described, even by former Virginia Attorney General Mark Herring, as a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, which are historically associated with fear, confusion, and despair. But why would a person like Dr. Fauci lie about the science? Well, apparently, at least in part, this goes back to the question of the origins, which became the topic of a case brought after Independence Day in 2021, when, according to the president, on the first anniversary of the pandemic would have been over because of what he had described as the vaccines, for which there had not been enough, he claimed, when he had first assumed the office of the presidency, and for which now over 80% of Americans have been administered. On May 7th, 2021, the very last paragraph of a report published by CDC, there appeared a very simple statement. The infectious dose of SARS-CoV-2 needed to transmit infection has not been established. And unless you know something about the development of vaccines, this simple statement would probably mean nothing at all to you. However, infectious dose, a standard epidemiological metric, and very easy to ascertain since 1870 through validation of causation by performing Koch's postulates, is a quantifiable metric that is required to determine in quantifiable serological titers the proper correlates of protection so as to enable the development of an effective vaccine and not simply efficacious in a force-on-force ratio. And the only way in which to develop an effective vaccine without knowledge of the infectious dose is to conduct a large sample-size phase 3 clinical trial, a fact that certainly a pharmaceutical company or vaccine developer should know, especially in an enterprise that had generated billions of dollars in revenue and who would not be motivated by the opportunity for easy money. The Pfizer vaccine was not approved by FDA until August 23, 2021, had before been released under an emergency use authorization declaration, for which the standard for approval is only an efficacy test, and no effectiveness test to date has yet been completed. But by that time, more than 163 million Americans had been fully vaccinated. According to the CDC, 70% of adults had received at least one shot, essentially participants in a phase 3 clinical trial, but not simply for effectiveness, but also for safety. And the most recent report suggests that there is a combined 16% risk of serious adverse events associated with just the mRNA vaccines produced by Pfizer and Moderna, a risk assumed to prevent infection by a disease with only a 1.1% case fatality rate in the United States, were you to even be infected by the virus. A risk of serious adverse events as high as 36% for those who volunteered to be administered the Pfizer vaccine.
Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Adjure te spiritus nequissime. Per Deum omnipotentum. The power of Christ compels you.
Because of the reasonable suspicion raised by the lack of knowledge of a rather easy to determine infectious dose that remained unknown by March 23, 2021, a FOIA request had been submitted to the White House simply to determine whether this standard epidemiological metric was classified information, because under Executive Order 12958, this metric could only be classified if the government had owned or controlled the causative biological agent for COVID-19, a disease that to date has been attributed to the deaths of over 1 million Americans and over 6.5 million worldwide, a sum exceeding the deaths of the Holocaust in half the time. And under Molecular Pathology Associates v. Myriad Genetics, Inc., the government could only classify and own the novel coronavirus beyond a reasonable doubt if it had been manipulated or cultivated in a laboratory. As of March 7, 2022, on the shadow docket, the official position of the government was in Webb v. Fauci, record number 21-6868, that the government can neither confirm or deny that these metrics are classified. That is a matter presently on final appeal before the Supreme Court, record number 218242.
I believe it's one of the most ghostly manifestations that I have ever seen. Whether it is real or simply conjecture, one of those things that people seeking to find some mystery to fool themselves into believing, but with some other perfectly rational cause is a question that only you can answer with your capacity for reason. Impossible. So was Xeroxing and holography just a few years ago. In fact, so were videotape replays like the one you're watching right now. People have been claiming an existence of God for thousands of years, and maybe one day you will finally know the answers as to how and why and what. What a tremendous gain that would be for science, but what a tragic loss for storytelling. No one knows the day nor the hour when all mysteries shall be revealed, but we'll be watching. And we'll be waiting in earnest, incessant, and fervent prayer for the advancement of the kingdom of God. Be sure to join us next time as events evolve with science and faith in a pandemic election that some have claimed is the presidential election of their lifetime. My name is Major Mike Webb, with liberty, honor, and excellence by God. We shall make America great again. Honest.
This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.
Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Vade retro satana. Adjure te spiritus nequissime. Per Deum omnipotentum. The power of Christ compels you.
But Master, why did you recant? They showed me the instruments, and I am old.